to the other oracle from Omaha, Dr. Art.
Thank you. I appreciate Matthew's tolerance and goodwill in including a non-lawyer on the agenda, because I think I'm the only one who's not a lawyer. I am the son of a lawyer and the brother of a lawyer.
Well, you're
so I feel like I'm at least by association part of the plan.
That's right.
And I do talk about legal issues, but not with a fine-grained eye of detail you've heard just now that we will hear probably remaining. My talk has got a couple of motives. One motive is to try to defend a book that I published a couple of years ago from attacks I get on it. And one of the book was called Openness to Creative Destruction, Sustaining Innovative Dynamism. And part of what I claim, I like the phrase innovative dynamism better than creative destruction, so that's what I usually use. I claim that innovative dynamism, a system that has minimal government, that encourages innovation, it has two broad benefits. One benefit is the new goods, like air conditioning and automobiles and trains and rockets and cures for diseases. And the other main benefit comes through process innovations. And the one main benefit of the process innovations is that they bring down prices of both the older goods that we've had for a long while and the new goods that are brought about by innovative dynamism. Well, the criticism that I get for that is, hey, one of my students just a week ago in my seminar said, that sounds plausible in some cases, but have you seen the bill that I'm getting for the insulin that I have to buy on a regular basis? And it's not just insulin. We know that drug costs have gone up, and they seem to be continuing to go up, and that's true also of healthcare. So part of why I'm interested in looking at clinical trials is I think this is part of the answer. I don't think it's the whole answer, but I think it's part of the answer. I meant to start my timer so that I don't get too far over. Is the aim about 15 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. So that's part of my motivation is I want to see why does this seem to be an exception to the general case that I was making in the book. Is it really an exception, or are there things going on in this industry that actually fit in with the general storytelling, which I think is true. A second reason is as I get older, I'm more and more anxious that medicine advance more quickly because I want to stay around. And I want the people I care about to stay around. And I'm frustrated that we're putting in more and more money, and we seem in some way to be getting less and less. So it's both to understand what's happening with the pricing and to understand why the rate of advance is slower that motivated me to look at this. And I don't think that clinical mandated clinical trials are the whole answer, but I think they're part of the answer. If you want some of the other parts of the answer, just to say briefly, there's a neat book by a guy named Marty McCary, who's head of one branch of surgery at Johns Hopkins, called The Price We Pay, something like that, where he talks about other reasons why this sector is messed up, including the lack of price transparency, the role of a lot of middlemen who are taking a big cut, and various other things. But I think clinical trials are a big part of it. Here I just start out with a little bit of statistics to document what we already know, which is that costs are going up, whether you look at it on an individual per capita basis, whether you look at it as a percentage of GDP, and not just going up if you compare it to 100 years ago, going up within the last 20 years. If you think about, it's harder to get a handle in a precise statistical way about are we getting our money's worth in terms of the breakthroughs. But one book that I love that I'm going to talk about a lot today is by Azra Raza called The First Cell, and she's a cancer specialist. And she points out that there's been some advances in cancer. But she says, for the most part, if you look at deaths, and that's the final criterion, right? If you look at deaths, cancer deaths have declined, but not really so much due to drug breakthroughs or therapy breakthroughs, mainly because of two things. Fewer people are smoking, and we have better early detection. And that's really what's driven most of what advance we have. In terms of actual, I'll say more in a minute. My hypothesis is that a major cause of both problems, both the high costs and fewer cures, are that we mandate randomized double-blind clinical trials. And for shortness of me talking, I'm just going to call those RCTs, which is one common abbreviation. Now, how costly are these RCTs? Most clinical trials consist of 3 phases. I mean, not all of them make it to phase 3, but the ones that are more successful go through 3 phases. Phase 1, and you see different estimates of a low end and a high end. The first couple of phases are are mainly about safety. And then they're coincidentally collecting whatever they can about efficacy. The phase 3 is primarily about efficacy. And notice how much more expensive phase 3 is than the other two. Whether you go with the low estimates or the high estimates, phase 3 is more than the sum of both phase 1 and phase 2. That's going to be relevant to what I suggest in the end in terms of policy reform. Phase 3 trials involve often tens of thousands of patients. You saw that with the vaccine trials that we've seen recently. And they also last for many years. And the problem is you've got to collect enough evidence to see if there's a difference in response statistically between the active ingredient and the placebo. One problem is this is already high. The costs are high and they're getting higher. And one reason they're getting higher apparently is that there is an increasing placebo effect for reasons that aren't entirely clear. This is an interesting issue. There was a New York Times Magazine article a couple of years ago that mentioned this, and you listen to Econ Talk with Russ Roberts. He interviewed this guy Greenberg who talked about this. And that means that more people are responding positively. When they're in a trial, they respond positively, not just to the effect of the actually active drug, but to a placebo they're given, which seems a little weird. But the effect here is it increases the cost of phase 3. Another thing that increases the cost of phase 3 is that there's a whole industry that's grown up of middlemen whose job it is to help firms conduct and push through to the final conclusion these clinical trials, especially phase 3. There's a neat book by a guy named Barry Worth called The Antidote, where he drills deep. He embeds himself with a firm called Vertex that had the goal of becoming a new mainstream pharma firm that maintains the innovative dynamism of a startup. That was the goal of the founder, a guy named Boger, Joshua Boger. Well, they had one of their first successful drugs after many millions of dollars, I think billions of dollars, and after many years, they had one of their first successful drugs for hepatitis C, and they had a very active vice president who was a real innovator and real firebrand, but he irritated the lead regulator, a guy named Russ Fleischer. And so, you know what the company did? The company fired him, even though they thought he was wonderful. Boger said, I love this guy, but I've got to fire him because we have to hire somebody who can get along with the regulator. So they hired someone who they named the Russ Whisperer, right? As in Russ Fleischer. They have a whole infrastructure within this company that originally had been a dedicated, innovative startup, the kind of firm that does innovation. And they're hiring people and firing people based on who is good at kissing up to the regulators. Well, that's another expense, right? And it's hard to quantify, but apparently it's significant. So you've got high costs from these RCTs. And the high costs, there are other public choice issues besides the one I just mentioned related to these costs, other kinds of costs. And because it really is kind of a public choice issue with having having to kiss up to the regulators, right? But there are other problems, if you think about it, that raise the costs of RCTs, especially the third phase. Both of my examples come from a book by Mukherjee, Siddhartha Mukherjee, which is a great book on cancer. Paul Carbone was one of the innovators in saying that chemotherapy could help with breast cancer. To do the clinical trial that was necessary to prove that, the RCT, he had to get a lot of people enrolled. Who's going to enroll the patients? The people who are the current physicians for those patients. Who are the current physicians under the incumbent strategy therapy? Surgeons. So he had to go to surgeons to get them to enroll their patients in a test of chemotherapy. What is their incentive? Surgeons think, probably, often, usually sincerely, but they also have a financial interest in saying surgery is the answer, not chemotherapy. So both because they think it's in the interest of their patients, but also it's in the interest of themselves. They're going to be very reluctant to enroll their patients in this clinical trial, which means it's very hard to get a clinical trial that's going to radically transform therapy for a disease, right? It happened with chemotherapy. It was really hard to put it together. It also happened with another breast cancer therapy. Bernard Fisher said lumpectomy would be just as effective, but less invasive, and so better for women. He had a heck of a time getting the surgeons who had patients who they were going to do radical mastectomies and enrolling the patients in the lumpectomies. And that also made it very hard to put together together. So these public choice costs are also substantial. The costs, and this is a general argument, these costs result in there being fewer new cures. And that's something people say, why are there fewer new cures? Is it we just run up against the wall against science? Science, we found everything we could know and things are going to slow down? That's not the answer. I don't think that's the answer. The answer is our rules, our institutions. There's a lot of evidence that some of the main sources of breakthrough innovations are entrepreneurial startups, not these big incumbent, long-lasting pharma firms. And the problem, Baumel has a neat obscure paper on that. Christensen's books also support that. There are many sources of this claim. The problem is these kind of startups can't afford phase 3. Often they can't even afford phase 1 or 2, but they sure can't afford phase 3. So if they are the only entities that can afford these clinical trials are the big, incumbent, entrenched pharmas, then it's much less likely that they're going to be the kind of firm that's going to have the innovation, culture, drive, intensity that has in the past created breakthrough innovations. What happens? What do startups do faced with these constraints? Well, there's really only two paths for them. One is to sell out to a big pharma. I've got to read more about Genentech. I'm on the early stages of this paper. But I think Genentech's an example. The other choice is the one that Vertex did, this book written by Barry Wirth that I mentioned. What they did was they tried to grow to a size and to have enough people to do all the things a big firm has to do. That means you have to have a big legal staff. That means you have to have a big sales staff. That means you have to have a big lobbyist staff. You have to bring in all these people. And part of what Barry Wirth concludes is that it watered down the innovative intensity and culture of the original firm that Joshua Boger had founded. And that bringing all these people in created a culture where they were more concerned with kissing up to the regulators and kissing up to Wall Street than they were with breakthrough innovations to cure terrible, dreaded diseases. And that's a sad thing, right? Because in an earlier book he wrote, I can't remember the name, but it was called A Breakthrough, if I remember, something like that. He showed how promising this firm was, this Vertex firm was, in its early days. This is the book, the second of his books, The Antidote.
I think the first one was called $1 Billion Molecule.
Thank you. I was wrong. He's right. The $1 Billion Model. This is the other book that I mentioned, Roz's book, The First Cell. And she talks about how the way we have set things up, and more, she drills down into a more detailed story consistent with what I'm saying. She thinks that if you want to cure cancer, what you do is you don't do what we're doing now. What we're doing now is mainly going after the problems at the end, after people are in stage 4 and near death. They're developing new drugs to help them live a few weeks longer with a whole bunch of side effects. That's what's going on mainly. You think about it, why would they do that? She says if you really want to get cancer, there's a shot you can do it, but you got to go at the early cells when they first start showing up. You got to identify them and get rid of those early cells. Why aren't firms doing what she suggests? She's sharp, she gives a good case, she's at a top institution. Why don't they listen to her? Well, they don't listen to her because it's really costly to do that. And these big pharma firms are having to kiss up to Wall Street. They're having to do these clinical trials. If you want to do a clinical trial, you want to have some shot at getting your money back. You got to convince Wall Street of that, right? Otherwise, they're not going to invest the millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to support these clinical trials. And so what are you going to do? You're much more likely, it's still a long shot, but you're more likely to get a success with an incremental drug at the end of life than you are with a slam, bang, total breakthrough early on. Why is that? Because you already know you're doing something similar to something that's already worked. That increases your odds. Also, if you do it at the end of life, you don't have to carry it very long to measure efficacy. If you do something early on, you're going to have to follow through maybe 20 years to be able to measure efficacy. And that hugely increases the costs. So not because it can't be done scientifically, but because we are imposing such high costs on them to do it, they're focusing on areas where it's almost going to be guaranteed that they're not going to cure cancer. They're just going to give us a few additional weeks with a huge amount of side effects for our money, right? And that's, at least the argument I'm making, based on, partly on what she's given us, is what we do when we mandate these clinical trials. Now, you might say, this is a sad story, Diamond. This is the gold standard. That's what we say about this book. The gold standard. It's like if you're doing anything else, you're in the bush leagues. You're an amateur. If you're going to talk about human life, you only can trust the gold standard. We've heard that with the vaccines, right? Anytime anybody suggests something that hasn't gone through the clinical trial, Fauci will say, nope, can't do that. It hasn't gone through the mandated clinical trials. But I'm here to tell you there's other sources of knowledge besides the three-phased RCTs. There's some vague knowledge that I think is really knowledge. This is more speculative, so I'm not going to spend much time. But there's a recent book called The Pattern Seekers. Human beings are good at finding patterns. That's one thing maybe why we've done so well. And sometimes we don't even know the patterns consciously. That's something that Gigerenzer has said, Melanie Mitchell. Both of them have needed interviews with. If you don't read their books, get the short version, listen to Russ Roberts' interviews with them anytime talking. But I want to say something that I think I can say more strongly and more people will accept toward the same goal. There are other ways to know that are respectable and that have been shown to have good results. There are nimble trial and error experiments. Freiwig, who died just recently, alas, did that with finally creating a chemotherapy cocktail to cure childhood leukemia. DeVita followed his mentors, he was a student of, in effect, of Freiwig, to do the same kind of procedure to put together a chemotherapy cocktail to cure some cases of Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's natural experiments. You can't always do those, but when you can, it has the same respectability as a clinical trial. And then there are observational studies, and this is what is viewed in great contempt by the advocates of the gold standard. But as an economist, it makes me real uncomfortable because that's almost all we do as economists. So if they really are saying the only thing that matters are these double-blind clinical trials, what they're in effect saying is everything you economists do is trash. And it's not all trash. Not this many so take it with a grain of salt. Because now there's a public choice element with me, right? Because I've got an incentive, well, I personally don't do that in the studies. But I do really believe the observational studies, they can be done better and they can be done worse, but I think they can be done in a way to yield knowledge. And it's not just what I think, who cares what I think. Marty McCary, in this book that I mentioned earlier, he has a page or two on clinical trials where he cites literature where they've done an experiment that's really neat. What they've done is they've looked for cases in the literature where somebody's done an observational study and then they later do a clinical trial. Let's see how often they agree, right? And they usually, almost always agree. I've got to drill deeper. I just read the abstract. I haven't read the full paper of the research he's referring to. But if that's the case, then why not use the cheaper method that's been shown to almost always predict what's going to be found when you go through the enormous expense of the clinical trial? You get more information quicker, cheaper, and that means you're going to have more people doing more experimentation and more adventuresome experimentation. You're going to have lower costs. You're going to have more cures. I'm at the time that I was to Amos, so I had a couple of other things I was going to say. I can't not do this. If you really believe it's gold standard, then apply it to parachutes, right? Somebody's done that in this paper, where they've done a search of literature on the clinical RCTs done about efficacy of parachutes, right? And they found the result that there are no studies, RCTs that have been done for parachutes, and therefore, if it doesn't meet the gold standard to follow Fauci's rules, we shouldn't be using parachutes, right? Or we should conduct clinical trials. And if you're lucky to get the parachute, if not, you'll jump out without it, and then we'll know whether parachutes work or not, right? There's somebody who's worried that he's doesn't have a parachute. I was going to talk about ethics, but I'm over already. Just one word. How is it that authoritarian governments in China and Russia let their citizens take the vaccines that they created after phase 2, which is safety, where we, a free nation, required our citizens to not get it until past the phase 3? Just to think about that for a minute. Policies. I once heard Milton Friedman say, when my mentor Ben Roby said, if there was a button in front of you that you could push, the FDA would disappear immediately. Milton, would you push that button? And Milton had that huge grin he sometimes had, and he said yes. So the ideal for me is Milton Friedman pushes his button. But I know that, and I'm not saying you can't do these clinical trials. I'm just saying don't mandate it. Don't make us do it. What's more politically achievable, and I've argued for this in 2 little op-ed pieces. One is test for safety. Stop at phase 2. Let people do it after. The cost would go down enormously. We'd have more innovation, lower costs. Another possibility, and I don't know why the libertarians didn't embrace this with this epidemic. We would have gotten people could volunteer, and there's 60,000 people who signed the website to volunteer get a vaccine and be exposed to the virus. With a couple hundred people volunteering like that, you could find out if these vaccines were effective. In effect, do a phase 3. You could do it in a few weeks rather than several months. Either of these would have helped our current situation with COVID-19. I've taken a couple minutes longer than I intended, but let me end with that. Thank you.
Sure. Hey, let's have a round of applause for Dr. Diamond.
Thank you.
We will have 2 or 3 questions for Dr. Diamond based on his excellent presentation.
Yes, sir.
How much of what you're talking about can just be reduced to something as easy as decades of regulatory capture between pharmacy and big government?
Yeah, I think that that's a good bit of it, but I don't, it's not very generous to say that. And I can see some of these things develop for other reasons. People were doing, for instance, McCary, this is a little off this my particular story, but he talks about the middlemen and how much that, the middlemen, it started out serving a legitimate purpose because there were so many drugs. The purchasers of these drugs, like hospitals, found it was worth their while to have somebody who specialized in knowing all the details of these drugs. And so they were serving some purpose. And it would be sort of like going to Sam's where you have this central purpose, central institution that was offering these things at a low price and collecting commission. After a while, though, the middleman found ways to increase their margin at the cost of people, both drug makers and hospitals. And so I'm not sure initially it was intended that way, but it somehow developed that way, and maybe it's hard to do. But you may be right. That's the cynical explanation. Anybody else? Yeah, Lauren.
Or do you think that third-party payment is largely built into this problem?
I do think that's a problem with costs. I think in terms of political feasibility, it's hard to tell people that the problem is you've got to pay it yourself. And people are scared of that, especially when they see the current high costs. If you buy my story, and your first goal is to get the clinical trials done, get the costs lower, and then tell people, let's do away with third-party payment, you're going to pay it yourself, and the costs are going to come down, so what you're paying yourself isn't going to be burdensome. But if you say it right now, and the current atmosphere say what you're saying, we get lynched. And I don't want to see a lynched.
I'm getting vaccinated free of cost today.
Yes.
No matter how, I'm guessing the same for you and the
Yes.
rest of them. In that case, why are we going to care whether or not it's the gold standard or merely the brass standard?
Well,
Gold works for me.
right. But the problem is you could have had it a few months earlier. And I don't know about you, but I was stressed during those few months. I was hunkering down. Every time I went into a restaurant to pick up a takeout meal, I was nervous. And I know I'm nervous. I'm too nervous. My best friend told me I'm not macho. Which is just sort of the confidence. The jury get me if it wants. But I spent several months with a huge amount of stress. You wouldn't have had to do that if you'd only had to take it after phase 2.